What an answer to prayer. Even if it seemed like it had come way too late for Zechariah and Elizabeth to take part in it and be useful in it, it was God's perfect timing. This morning I was reminded of a story about timing and about appreciating things. I was reminded of a story of a young man who had grown up in a family of great wealth and prestige and honor, but had a father who was very intentional on making sure that his son did not grow up with an entitlement mentality. And this young man was about ready to graduate from college, and he had the expectation that the gift he would receive from his father would be great, because after all, his father had great wealth and great means, and his father had always taught him if he worked hard, he would be rewarded. If he worked hard, he would achieve great. And, he wanted more than anything a nice, fancy sports car. His father knew that. Everyone that ever met the man knew that. And he was about to graduate at the top of his class. He'd already been accepted to Harvard Law School. Things were going well for this young man. And he went in the day of graduation to his father's study and to talk with his dad, but basically just to get his gift so he could arrive in style at graduation commencement exercises. And the young man went in, and his father said, "Son, I'm so proud of you. The hard work you've put in. Today you'll realize the first step and the first leg of that journey." And his son was basically, yeah, gift. That was the mindset he had. And his father gave him and handed him the gift, and he opened it, and it was a Bible. And immediately the son was he was a lot angry and frustrated. And he said, "A Bible? I've got a Bible. I don't need a Bible." And he stormed out of his father's office, and he stormed out of his father's life. Until one day, his father was really sick and ill, and he'd got the call that he needed to go now, or he'd never see his father this side of life again. And he went, and he got to his father just before he passed, and his father handed him once again the Bible that he gave him on graduation day. And the young man said, "You tried this before. Don't you remember we haven't spoken for 40 years because your gift was not really what you could have given?" Basically telling him his father was a cheap gift giver. And he said, "Son, I love you. I've always loved you. I've prayed for you to come back and for our relationship to be restored. But even if that doesn't happen, I encourage you to open the Bible." So right there, the young man opened the Bible, and out came a key with a note that read, "Son, I'm so proud of you, and you'll never know how much I love you." And at the bottom of that was a receipt that said "paid in full." Because the young man didn't take the opportunity to open the book, to investigate the gift any further, he missed 40 years of relationship with his father. He missed 40 years of sharing joys and sorrows, his children, his wife, with his father. Because he was so focused on what he thought he needed and what he thought he wanted and what he thought he should be given, he missed out on the real gift that his father was trying to give him. His father was trying to connect him in with something greater than just a car. His father was trying to connect him into a greater relationship with him and a greater relationship with the Heavenly Father. And the young man was too busy going through the rest of his life and making a name for himself separate from his father and that family name, going to law school and once again graduating at the top of his class and setting up his own law firm and rising through the ranks, that the young man had missed opportunity after opportunity after opportunity for peace and joy that money, that career, and other things could not buy. And this story kind of hit me because I thought about how many times, not just at Christmas, but how many times throughout the year do we get so busy with everything we think we have to do, every place we think we need to be, or everything that we think we deserve or that we're entitled to, that we miss some of God's greatest blessings. And that was kind of hard to think about. But there are so many things that God would show us or have us do and experience that look an awful lot like a pair of overalls and hard work. Have you ever heard that? There's so many things that we miss that seem pretty common and don't really seem like a big deal at all until we start to unwrap them, until we start to really spend more time, be more reflective, and be more caring. There is no doubt in my mind that Zechariah and Elizabeth, even as successful as he was spiritually and as a spiritual leader within the faith, that I think Zechariah probably felt a little bit like a failure. Don't you? He was not able to have kids. Elizabeth probably definitely felt like she was a failure, like her life had not really been much of a matter or much of importance. But yet they'd still been persistent in prayer. They'd still been faithful to God. They still trusted. Even though they were very old, they knew that God had a purpose and a plan for them. And it was probably a little natural that Zechariah was just a little bit surprised when now the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, your wife is with child. How many of you that are in your more experienced years of life would just be totally giddy and excited if you found out that you were going to be with child? I have an aunt and uncle that have never had children, and they've been really close to all the nephews and nieces. But I'm pretty sure if they found out now they were going to be with child, they wouldn't necessarily see how that was going to be good. But God had an amazing purpose for Zechariah and Elizabeth. It was in perfect timing, even though nothing but the world could explain made it seem like it was going to be perfect timing. And, Zechariah and Elizabeth had something to do in God's plan for their life, more than just raising the forerunner of Jesus Christ. Elizabeth, being more experienced in the world, having wisdom and knowledge, was going to be able to counsel young Mary, who was very young. By all accounts, we think between the ages of 12 and 15 or 16. And young Mary was experiencing, we don't really get the full extent of this because we kind of sanitize it and make her, this amazing young girl, which she was. But Mary was ridiculed. And Mary would have been shunned. And Mary would have been gossiped about. Just like any young girl that gets pregnant now at 12 or 15, society really has a lot to say about that, don't they? A lot of judging goes on. Mary would have been judged, ridiculed, and despised in just the same ways 2,000 years ago. Mary needed someone, as she is carrying the Christ child, the Messiah, that knew exactly what she was going through, that could encourage her and support her, not just as a family member, but someone that understood and believed it was truly God's plan for her to carry this child. And Mary found that in Elizabeth, because God had used Elizabeth at the perfect time to carry out the perfect role. And Elizabeth and Zechariah were the perfect parents for John the Baptist, who would be the forerunner of Christ, who would go and bring people back to go into the wilderness, the desert, and remind them that God was someone that should have their attention and should have their reverence and their awe. And John did that, and John worked tirelessly. And because of John, he really did pave the way for Jesus to come and to teach and preach. First Chronicles 16:11 says, "Look to the Lord and His strength. Seek His face always." Because Zechariah and Elizabeth were always focused on God, He found a way to use them. Even after it should have been physically impossible for them to be used in that way. Because with God, all things are possible. And He had to keep Zechariah quiet. He had to shut him up for a while so Zechariah could be humbled, even though he was at the height of his prestige as a Levitical priest. He had to quiet him down so he could be humbled and he could listen and learn. I'm sure none of us have ever experienced that. We've never been humbled, have we? We've never been quieted so we could listen and grow. And I'm sure Zechariah learned as much in those months leading up to the birth of John than he'd probably learned in his ministry before then. And sometimes we have difficult situations ourselves, and we don't understand why they go on at the time. But we may look back a year or 2 years or 10 years later. We may recognize how much we learned and grew in those days. The story of our young man and his father at the beginning. I don't know how many minutes, hours, days he had with his father after he finally realized the gift his father had been given. But I guarantee you that that young man, who was now a little older and a little wiser, at least in the ways of the world, lived the rest of his life a little differently. Don't you imagine? I presume that he was a little more focused on those relationships around him and to get underneath face value of things. At Advent, we're called to kind of dig a little deeper, not just to prepare our hearts and our minds, but we're called to dig a little deeper into what this love of God for us means, into what this relationship is. We're called to kind of answer the question, what is my responsibility in all this? It's easy to talk about love and grace and forgiveness and all those things, isn't it? And it's awesome to be like, I've claimed those things, I appreciate those things, but without persistent prayer, it's hard to stay in tune with those things. We can't be separated from Christ and living out God's plan for our life. We've got to be connected to Christ so we can do all the things that God had planned out for us. The things that will bring us true joy and peace and happiness. The thankfulness, the faithfulness, the persistence that Zechariah and Elizabeth exhibited was heard by God. Sometimes we forget that God answers prayers in 3 ways, not just 2 ways. Not just yes and we're happy, not just no and we're disappointed, but sometimes God, and this is even more frustrating I think than no, when God says not yet, or in a while, or in the perfect time, because we're not good waiters, are we? And I'm not talking about just restaurants. I tried that, wasn't very good at that either, but we're not patient people. We have drive-thrus for everything, almost, in our country. Food, pharmacy, needs, everything has a drive-up, drive-through, so we can go quick and not have to stop, not have to go in. Our time can be maximized doing a myriad of other things. But sometimes God is telling us to slow down, to relax, to wait. And what we'll receive in our waiting will be even greater than what we would have gotten if it would have been answered just like that. Sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers the way we want them to be answered because He has something better planned for us. Something even better than we could script up or write out or imagine. It's hard for us to understand that sometimes. But there's no doubt that God had a plan for Elizabeth and Zechariah that was far better than they could have imagined. Far more important to the history of the world. I mean, Mary being the mother of Jesus, that's the most important mothering job anybody's ever had. And everybody's mothering job is important. Because every child that you raise up is a chance to connect to Christ. But Elizabeth got the chance to mother and to nurture John the Baptist, the one to go and pave the way for Jesus. That was a pretty important job, wasn't it? And as parents, and especially as mothers, there's times I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you find the strength and the patience and the courage. Because even if you're not raising Jesus's and John's, you're raising a child that is so important and so valuable to God that He gave His own Son for your child. That's a pretty awesome thing, isn't it? And during the season of Christmas and Advent, we can get so caught up in everything else. But yet sometimes we just need the basic reminder of what Christmas is all about, of that gift of Christ who came to set us free from any other worry, any other anxiety we have, that in Him we can have hope and a future. In Him we can have peace and comfort. In Him everything will work out in the end. The question I want to leave you with is not an easy question, but it's a pretty simple question. What is God preparing you for this Advent, this Christmas season? Because each and every one of us, from the very youngest to the most experienced in life's days, has something that God would use us for or use us in to bring a little bit of heaven to earth. That's the joy of being a child of God. And my prayer and my question for you is that you will search that out, that you will seek the answer to where God is wanting to use you or how He's wanting to maybe increase what you do so others may be blessed and others may grow in relationship to God. It may be something within your family. It may be something within your work. It may be something within a volunteer group that you're associated with. Maybe something within the church, the community. But I think God has something for each and every one of us this Christmas season that will bring more Christ to our community, not just in the next few weeks, but from now to the end of days. Amen.